Yes. So once again, we are very happy to have you here Durk Gorter with us, who is not just one of the founders of linguistic landscapes as a research field, but also one of the most prominent experts on linguistic landscapes in education. So he is ICAR Basque research professor at the University of the Basque Country in Spain. He is head of the Donostia research group on education and multilingualism. He carries out research on multilingual education, European minority languages, and linguistic landscapes. And currently he does research related to multilingual competence in education in the Basque Country and in Friesland. He published, edited, and co-edited several volumes or special issues on linguistic landscapes, and among his more recent publications are Multilingual Education Between Language Learning and Translanguaging, co-edited with Jason Sinos in 2015, and a special issue of System on Pedagogical Translanguaging, Navigating Between Languages at School and at the University. He teaches in the European Master in Multilingualism and Education, and he is also editor-in-chief of the journal Language, Culture and Curriculum. The International Association of Multilingualism gave him the award of Distinguished Scholar of Multilingualism, and so we are very happy to have you here, and the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, and let's see how it goes with the technique and the sharing. I think I showed you my first slide, and now it's at work.
Yeah, we can't see
thank
it.
You. Thank you very much, Dank for inviting me to this the local linguistic landscapes event online. And I will give you a general introduction to the linguistic landscape, and then I will go to some of the projects that we have been doing. As we all know, we live in a very visual world with lots of signs, and sometimes there's even a kind of abundance of signs. And I start usually my presentation with this sign because it's very special, and some of you will know it and you will recognize it, and others will not, and I will come back to it and I'll explain it to you why I start with this sign. So let's go to the introduction. We talk about landscape, and what is a landscape? Well, we're looking at a landscape actually. It's an expanse of scenery seen from one place, that's one meaning, and at the same time it's a picture representing such a view. So that is the important thing for linguistic landscape studies, that we have a literal meaning and we have a representational meaning. So we can look at both of those. And then, of course, we can look at the whole of the picture, but we can also look at a certain detail and we can zoom in. And then we look at this detail for a more investigation. But of course, the question is, what do we mean by linguistic landscape? What kind of definition do we have of linguistic landscape? There are several definitions around, and one that I used myself a long time ago already is the use of language in its written form in the public sphere. So that's a bit, one could say, a kind of narrow definition, because when we produced this book also some years ago, we asked ourselves the question with Alana Suhami, what is linguistic landscape really? Does it refer to language only, or also additional things which are present around us, like images, sounds, buildings, clothes, or even people? And then we said, well, it's the attention to language in the environment, the words and the images that are displayed and exposed in public spaces. That is the center of attention in linguistic landscape. And this comes back in a way in the Journal of Linguistic Landscape Studies that was appeared a few years ago. And there it says in the scope of the journal that to describe and identify the patterns of the presence and absence of languages in public spaces. That is the core of it, to understand the motives, the pressures, the ideologies, the reactions, the decisions of people. All these things are related to linguistic landscape. So it's language, words, images as they are displayed in public spaces. That is the important, but then of course you can expand it, and you can expand it further and further. The important thing for me is that you can ask many different questions and interesting questions when you look at this. Like, for instance, who puts up the signs? I caught a guy doing it, but of course, was he responsible, or was it the municipality in the city where I live? Or what signs are placed, where and when? or taken down in this case? Or how many signs do we encounter? Or what is the meaning of the sign? This is kind of incredible, but it's a wall that you can put your own sign together, full strength. Which languages are used? This is a kind of multiple monolingualism of tourist guides that we find in many different languages. But of course, there's always a choice of which language is chosen or which is not. And then, of course, why are certain languages used or not? And sometimes languages are threatened to be taken down, like here in Carinthia, where they wanted to take down the Slovenian part of the bilingual signs, and the man changed himself to the sign. So there is a lot of different ways or different questions to ask, and that means also that there's a whole kaleidoscope of theoretical approaches towards the linguistic landscape. And people come from various disciplines when they study the linguistic landscape. For instance, language policy is very important, social linguistics and applied linguistics also, but also semiotics. And things like onomastics, the names in the linguistic landscape, advertising, and that's one of the things I focus on today, is education. There are several recurrent themes also that come back in linguistic landscape studies in many different ways. And one of the most important ones, and I will put it central today, is multilingualism. But also things like the globalization, the spread of English, power relationships, education, tourism, etc. So there are several themes that come back in linguistic landscape studies. And there is a whole issue of the methodology of linguistic landscape studies, because we have a unit of analysis, but it's not always completely clear what is the unit of analysis, what is a sign, is it something in an identifiable frame, or has to be a more holistic approach? How do we do the sampling? Where do we do the sampling? Do we do some mapping? Well, it's in a way, it's all under construction, you could say. And of course, one of the characteristics of linguistic landscape work is to take a lot of photographs. You can also do it nowadays through Google Maps, and you can visit many streets all around the world, and you can see the linguistic landscape in distant or less accessible areas, as Guy Pussy said some years ago. Of course, it's very important that in many places there are regulations around the linguistic landscape, the way you can put up signs, the size of the signs, where they can be put, what can be on the signs, and of course also related to language. And in the case of minority languages, it's very important if you have a presence or you're not present in the linguistic landscape. The absence of language, the absence of a minority language can be very telling also. Or there can be a dispute over the language, a contestation of, like in the street very near to my house, they were overpainting the Spanish part of the street name, Calle Matia, Matia Calea in Basque. So this person who painted it over wanted to see more Basque and less Spanish. In order to try to bring together all these different approaches, these different elements, we have proposed a model, what we call the multilingual inequalities in public spaces model, to try to have a holistic approach, where we start with the language policy processes, the design, the part where the policy is developed, then the actual making of the sign itself, because there are, of course, can be several people involved. It can be an individual that puts a handwritten note, but it can also be a very elaborate, very costly sign that's made by the sign making industry, which is a multi-million euro industry. And then the central part of the model is the unequal languages on signage in public spaces, because languages is very hard to put them there equally, because one goes on top, one comes on the bottom, one goes left, one goes right, one goes with a larger font or a smaller font. So languages are almost inevitably unequal the way they are placed in the public space. And this is kind of the core, the center of most of the linguistic landscape studies. But at the same time, it's very important also to see what people can read, what people do see of the signs, what people observe, what they perceive. More and more people are looking at that also. And then, because we know that people don't read everything that they see and read in the linguistic landscape. And then, of course, it influences the way people behave. What do they think? What do they do? If there is a sign that tells you to do something, are you really obeying the sign? If it's forbidden to smoke, or if you have to go left, or of course, many signs are commercial. They invite you to buy something. Are people doing these things? So that is also important. So that is, and then this feeds back with that arrow on the bottom into the language policy process. Again, what people think and do about the linguistic landscape. So that's the idea of it. As you can see, it's a very productive field. Many publications, many books have been published. We have an online bibliography that's maintained by Rob Troyer. And there are over 1,150 items in that bibliography at the moment. And it's really an exponential growth, because if you look at 2007, there were like 30 publications. And if you look at it now, there are like 1,150. So it has really grown enormously, the field. Okay, that was by way of introduction, and I want to focus a bit now more on the linguistic landscape in the context of education. There have been some major development, and I think that this is part of it, because according to Shihami and Pennycook, an important development in linguistic landscape studies is the expansion to the global south. The second important development is that it's focusing now on broader semiotics, that we look at bodies, for instance, at tattoos, but also the smellscapes, graffiti, different ways of linguistic landscapes at markets and combinations there. There's more an ethnographic understanding that goes beyond only the analysis of discourse, and the educational possibilities to develop critical awareness. These are the four major developments that they distinguished. And we said it ourselves already that linguistic landscape is a context that provides for us in education a promising way to teach about languages, multilingualism, language awareness, and literacy practices. And I don't think I have to convince you here in this symposium about this fact, because this project is all about this in a way, after all. There have been some recent collections about these possibilities of education. So we have the collection by Malinowski and his colleagues on language teaching in a linguistic landscape. We have linguistic landscape beyond the language classroom, edited by Greg Mead and Corinna Seals. And we have the linguistic landscape as an educational space. And I saw Adina is in the audience, so she's one of the editors, together with Victor Fernandez and Stephen Meyer. And they're not the only ones, because there's also quite an interesting online book on a pedagogical guidebook for English language teaching, but I think it's very useful also for other language contexts. And for those of you who are more in the German-speaking world, there is also this book by Evelyn Siegler and Heiko Martin on linguistic landscape in Deutschsprachigen context. So there are a great number of didactic application-oriented suggestion in these two books that can be also very useful, I think, for the people that participate in this project. Of course, that's what I said already. You are also very much on this, how to have linguistic landscape in the education context, and I think that it's a very important topic. I distinguish in a way between, on the one hand, the linguistic landscape as a pedagogical tool that you can use inside the classroom or outside of the classroom to teach languages, or to teach critical language awareness, or to use the linguistic landscape somehow as a pedagogical instrument for your teaching. And on the other hand, you have the idea of the schoolscapes, where linguistic landscapes are inside school buildings or just outside school buildings, or in educational institutions in a wider sense of the word. It was already Shihami and Waxman that said that linguistic landscapes are a powerful tool for meaningful language learning. And they used the Hapala Memorial in Tel Aviv as an example of how to use it, because the thing there is that Hebrew and English are there, but Arabic is missing. Also, Dajane and her colleagues send the children out into the cities in Montreal and Vancouver with a camera, at that time still disposable cameras, to discover the city and to learn to see the city, as it is dense with signs that must be deciphered, read, and interpreted. And you had Mariana yesterday here, and she has done a similar project in Aveiro in Portugal. And of course, you can do it also what they did in Taipei, an English literacy walk. And I think this is an important element that you have to make clear to the student, because otherwise they don't attend to the signs. They may be walking past these signs every day and they are not reading them really, or at least they don't are not aware of the potential that the signs have for language learning or for learning in general. This is more the schoolscapes, what Cara Brown did in the Furrow area in Latvia, looking at the signs inside the school, in the corridors and everywhere. And she found that they are very enriching. Part of the functions of these signs are enriching the national culture of Peru, and they are used as a historical artifact. So concluding this part, I think that the study of linguistic landscape item in an educational context, it offers relevant new information about education, both in the classroom and beyond. And the linguistic landscape in an educational context, they harbor considerable potential for language learning, for increased language awareness, and for critical reflection. So this is what we wrote in the afterword of the book that Edina and others edited. So let's look a bit at the studies that we have done ourselves. Over the years, we have done several studies that are related to language learning and education and linguistic landscape. And we have it more or less that where multilingual education and linguistic landscapes are overlapping, where they are touching each other. So we are in the intersection of multilingual education and linguistic landscape, and that is where we look at the schoolscapes also as a pedagogical tool, by the way. So we started with something from second language acquisition, and we wanted to see how meaning is constructed by different modalities. So different parts, and not only the language, the text, but also the different modalities. And we were convinced, our assumption was that in the linguistic landscape, you find authentic input for second language pragmatic development. I will show you an example of that. And we also think that the linguistic landscape can be used for, and we try to also show that with some examples, for language awareness and for enhancing linguistic diversity. So this was our first study. And we were looking there, one of the examples was a vending machine at the beach. Because even this simple vending machine that everybody knows can teach us a lot about multilingual literacy, multimodal literacy, the different colors that you see, the different materials that this machine is made of, the images that are there, those can all be part of it. And then, of course, if you go close up, we see there is Coca-Cola. Is that English or not? There is some Basque, Egari al-Sarra. There is some Spanish, tienes sed, so that means both are you thirsty, but in a way it's not necessary. All of us know in a way what this kind of machine is. And that's part of the pragmatic competence that you get, that this machine is of course inviting us to put a coin in there to get a can of drink. But at the same time, there is a thing of pragmatic competence going on. We were also looking in terms of this machine at where is it placed. It's at the beach, close to the beach. Why is the placement the way it is? How salient is it? How is it framed in this context? So you can look at all these dimensions. And one of the important things here is also the dynamics, because the linguistic landscape is not static, but it's dynamic. And we were shown this in a very, very literal, physical way, because in San Sebastian, where I live, we have a lot of storms. And then the machine was blown away and it was replaced by a new machine. So those are part of the dynamics. And well, we do have more storms. And then I was lucky enough, you could say, to find the machine on the beach. Okay, this was just a digression. We go to the second study, the study of the schoolscapes in the literal sense, and to look inside the schools at the functions of multilingual schoolscapes. And the aims of our study were to look at the functions and also to look at the school language in the linguistic landscape, and to look at who is producing the signs, who are the authors of the signs. So we looked in 6 schools, private and public schools, and religious, non-religious schools, a bit different schools with different social backgrounds, different multilingual models. And we collected 900, a bit over 900 photographs, and we distinguished 483 units. So our first research question, I will not deal with all of them, but was which function does the linguistic landscape have in multilingual schools in the Basque Country? And then the first thing we found or distinguished, the first function is to teach languages and subject content. As you can see here in English and in Spanish, that the linguistic landscape is used to teach language and content at the same time. It's also used for classroom management. We have here the timetable in Basque, but we also have a list of norms that we don't pull the hair of others, we don't shout, and a whole list of all these norms that the children have to sign their name at the bottom so that they agree to the rules. And this is then placed on the wall for everybody to see and hopefully to obey. It's also used for intercultural awareness. That's another function of the linguistic landscape. So it can be a welcome to the Basque Country for different immigrants, but also some cultural project about Japan. It's also used to teach values. Geroa alferaren le loa da. That was on the ceiling, a number of these slogans in one school. So later is the slogan of the lazy. Those kind of slogans are teach values. Every day you see them again. The awareness of the Basque language was another function we distinguished, because Euskara behar dugu, Euskara behar zaitu. We need Basque and Basque needs us. So this is the kind of encouragement for the children to be aware of the Basque language. Of course, also function like practical information of the school, the different floors, what can you find where, and what is in the different rooms, the numbers, and then the information about the room. Also school management, of where do you place your bike, of when we are in the corridor, we walk slowly, this kind of management things that were on the walls. Also commercial information to prepare for the Cambridge exams in this case, and also for collective events outside of the school, that there's the Corica and that you can participate. That's another function of the linguistic landscape of the school. And also mere decoration, that is also one of the functions. So in total, we distinguish 10 different functions that you can see repeated here. And the interesting thing is that some other people have picked this up and they have also used this function. And of course, then the promotion of the Basque language is not a function they find, but then there may be some other function they find in their specific context, because this is on the one hand general, but on the other hand also quite specific for the Basque Country, of course. Then a third project that we did is what was officially not called, but which was called quite quickly, the Translanguaging project. We did this in one Basque primary school, and it was a project about translanguaging mainly. On the one hand, pedagogical translanguaging, where you develop learning materials to encourage the use of different languages, and on the other hand, spontaneous translanguaging, looking at what children do spontaneously with the different languages. I will not go into that, that would be a different lecture, but I will use one of the examples from this project, because in this project we were allowing for multilingual practices. So we were using the different languages at the same time. And we also wanted to break through the language separation that existed in this school of having lessons in Basque, lessons in Spanish, lessons in English, and they were completely separated. We wanted to enhance the awareness about languages, increase metalinguistic awareness, and we were emphasizing the reading and writing skills, so not so much the oral skills. But these were the goals of the project in general. And we applied this for these students group. We applied it also for the linguistic landscape, as I will show you. And here you see what our students were like. They were at the end of primary school, grades 5 and 6. In total, we had almost 240 students. No, there was a total of 239 participants, but there were 190 different students because we did it in 2 different years. And some students were, of course, promoted from grade 5 to grade 6, so they participated 2 years. We had 3 experimental groups and we had 2 control groups, and the average age was 11 years. And the first languages were 1/3 or 29% Basque, half Spanish, and about 20% had both. And then there were some 5% who had other languages as their first language. We were, of course, looking at the linguistic landscape, the schoolscape of the school itself. So we saw on the one hand that there's quite a lot of Basque, but there's also quite a lot of Spanish. So we did a bit what we did with the functions, also looking at but I will not go into that. I will go into the learning modules. That we had 6 modules for 4 weeks, in total for 12 weeks. And we had 2 modules for each language class. But as you can see, we were breaking through the separation of the languages, because we had the languages next to each other: Basque, Euskara, Castellano, and English. So, and one module was on linguistic landscape. So, for instance, we were using some signs from the village, from the Pelicoria Conchi or the Ia Pandegia, and then we were explaining, as an example, how many languages are there, 2, which languages are there, and so we explained completely the idea of linguistic landscape. to the children. And also we were using exercises like how can you divide the words, the pelecoria in 2 parts, ia pandegia is in 3 parts, and also then in English, hairdressers. Those were examples that we used, and then we had the children fill them in themselves with other signs. They had to do the same thing and answer the same question, but then for different signs with different possibilities. And they also had to evaluate these 5 pictures that they saw. We also were working with cognates and derivatives and compounds. So we were doing things like hospital is hospital in Spanish, but hospitalia in Basque. So it looks quite similar. It's a cognate. And then how do you say it in English? Now it's your turn. So they had to do the clínica dental, the arts clínica. So clínica is again a cognate, but arts, of course, is a completely different word from a tooth or dental. And you have to also answer this for English. So they were working with the 3 languages at the same time with the linguistic landscape material that we provided for them. We were also working on meta-linguistic awareness quite a bit with compounds. For instance, in Basque, we have the word liburu denda. That's liburu plus denda. And then in English, it's the same, book plus shop. But in Spanish, it's completely different, libreria. And then we show to the kids that Basque and English share quite a lot of things. In this case, they share the structure, how their words are compounded. And we made them aware of that. And then they had to do it themselves with the examples you see below, like flower shop, lora denda, those kind of things. So they had to fill it in themselves and work with it. So then we also asked them to evaluate this linguistic landscape module. And then one of the students said, I learned a lot of new words. I didn't know what linguistic landscape was. Second student said, in almost all of them, the signs, you have 2 languages, you can learn words of those that say the same. And then another had discovered that there were 3 languages in our village. And the 4th said to divide words and to study cognates. So these are, of course, primary school children, but they were doing more or less what we wanted them to do, to learn from the linguistic landscape. Then another study that we did is on linguistic landscape and translanguaging, but in another sense, in the sense that we wanted to link the translanguaging that you find a lot in education to the study of linguistic landscape in another way. And we were looking at this bookshop that we find in one of the streets in San Sebastian, and we were looking at as a whole. And then we were looking at the shop window, and it's not very well seeable in the pictures, but I have the transliteration below. And then you see it is in 4 languages, but you have to know Basque why it is almost parallel translation. It's not a parallel translation, because in Basque they say something about language, and they don't do that in the other 3 languages. They only say that it's an international bookshop and something about travel. But in Basque it's also that they have language material. So it's almost parallel translation, which is of course interesting that they do that. Also the sign next to the shop window is quite interesting in terms of the meshing of the 4 languages. There are bilingual Basque and Spanish parts. There is a part in Basque only. There are some cognates like Africa and Europa, or near cognates like Mapa. There is the word English, there's the word Français. So it's quite an interesting mixture, meshing of the 4 languages. And then if you look at this again at the front of this bookshop, but then if you look a bit higher, you see that there are some scudos, some emblems there above the bookshop. And these are quite interesting in itself, because they show that in the house where now the bookshop is, these 2 gentlemen were born, Fermin La Sala and Fermin Calbeton. They have the same first name, but they were born in different years, like 21 years different. And they're very interesting because at the time that they were born, Basque was still the playground language, because only after 1863 that changed. So they were from important local families, but they probably knew Basque at the same time, while these 2 persons became very important for Spanish politics, because one became an ambassador for Spain and the other became the representative of Cuba in the Spanish parliament in Madrid. That still was in the time that Cuba was a colony of Spain. And also La Sala was also important for the railroads in the United States. He also contributed to that. So both persons were involved, you could say, in the spread of Spanish, and it was a kind of globalization before globalization. So from one point in the city, you can get to a worldwide view. I want to continue with another study we did more recently, and that is the San Martin market study. And this looks a bit like some of the work we had been doing before. But it was a more holistic approach, because not only did we take, again, a lot of photographs, but we also interviewed the salespeople that are in the market. We did observations of the language between the people and their clients, the salespeople and their clients, and we did some questionnaires with the clients and the visitors. So it was a more holistic approach to the whole study. And as you can see, we have published recently about it. I can give only a few things that I think would be relevant here in this context. And the first is a sign that is trying to influence the use of Basque directly. It is called, or you can translate it with a taste in Basque, but it has a list of 24 names of fish and seafood. So it's a kind of vocabulary list. At the same time, you could say it's also a cheat for people that don't know Basque so well, so they can ask for the fish in Basque to the fishmonger when they know the Spanish name and they see this sign in the stall of the fishmonger, and they can use it as a cheat sheet. And at the same time, it will be raising the awareness of the people, because it will make them more aware of that the possibility to use Basque. That's why try Basque, taste of Basque. And it is intended to encourage to use Basque more and more. It's also that there is something about learning from monolingual signs. This is in Spanish, la supera, somos la pera. But at the same time, it's wordplay. There is a blending going on of being super and pera in Spanish, but you have to be quite advanced Spanish speaker or Spanish learner. If you're a second language learner, you could learn from this sign, somos la pera, we are the best, we are very good. So there is a wordplay going on in this sign, but perhaps if you would just superficially read it, would not see and would not notice. So that's another thing that can happen in a linguistic landscape, of course. And then we saw some signs in the market that were related to a language campaign by a language academy. We have quite a few language academies. And they had these words in French and then in English below, beautiful words. And they encouraged you to take a course in French or in English with them. And then, of course, you have things like delicious croquetas. That is another interesting blend, because delicious is obviously English and not deliciosa like it could be in Spanish, but croquetas is not translated. So perhaps because it is too much of a specific local, locally made. On the other hand, croqueta is also known. So it is difficult to interpret exactly what they mean by this. But it became even more interesting when we found this sign, where we found the fraise, the strawberry in French, and we found it on a place where it had some other fruits. Oops. So we're not sure. We didn't ask whether the person in the stall did not know what fraise meant, or whether it was a coincidence. But it is quite an interesting example, of course, of what can happen when you have these things in the linguistic landscape. Well, I'm coming to another example that we did with the linguistic landscape studies, and that is the involvement of our master students. It was said in the introduction that I'm teaching in a master on multilingualism and education. And we involved our students as linguistic landscape investigators, because as Heike Martin and Sanita have said some time ago, it's an easy and enjoyable way of involving students in fieldwork. And you can increase with that the awareness of multilingualism and a better understanding of the hierarchies of language use and prestige. And so you can use the linguistic landscape quite well in the teaching. And that's exactly what we did. So we asked the student, basically in an assignment, we asked them 5 different questions. We asked them about, we gave them 5 signs, and we gave them 5 questions for each sign. And then we were asking them in what context is the sign placed, what meaning will passersby derive from the signs. Do you think that the reader has to be bilingual, or can he be or she be monolingual? What is the relative status of the languages, and how about multimodal dimensions? And then the students would have to go out into the streets and collect some data themselves, and we would present it in class and that's why that sign is there, the Pecha Kucha. I don't know if all of you know what that means, but that is a format in which you have 20 slides, and each slide is for 20 seconds, but it forwards automatically after 20 seconds. And that's always great fun in a class, but it's one of the ways to present in a short format. It's 6 minutes and 40 seconds always, so it will never be too long, the presentation. And that's quite nice. What we found was also that the student became a lot more aware of their surroundings, and one of the students, this is a reaction, one of the students, it was all in English because they were looking at the linguistic landscape, collecting the data, and then they found a lot of English, and it was like, all is in English. Oh, that was for them a big surprise because they would not expect that. Some other students were really emphasizing the contestation part. They were looking at signs that were painted over, and they collected the number of those signs that people had been painting over signs that were in Spanish, and then they put a big E on it of Euskera, Basque, and that they want to have more Basque, so they were collecting those kind of signs. And what we found with these students, a bit of the feedback is first student said it was totally different to see my same everyday environment with different lenses. I really enjoyed taking the class. And the other student said going to the street and having real pictures was crucial for me. I'm very conscious of the linguistic landscape that surrounds me now. And I can add to this that I recently met a student that had done the master like 5 years ago or something like that. And one of the first things that he told me is like, I still remember the linguistic landscape assignment, and I still look differently at the linguistic landscape after, I don't know, it was 5 years or something like that. So it has an impact on students that you sometimes don't realize as a teacher. You think, okay, we go to the next assignment on something else, but the linguistic landscape really can be impressive. So some conclusions. Well, first of all, I have to come back to the FedEx sign that I showed in the very beginning. And for those of you that don't know it, but there's an arrow here. And once you have seen the arrow, you will never forget. And whenever you see the FedEx sign and you will see it, you will see the arrow. The arrow is there. And now you have seen where the arrow is, and you will never be able to look at the FedEx sign without seeing the arrow. So I can tell you that already. So this is one of those things in the linguistic landscape that is hidden there. So I hope that I've convinced everybody, and I think I was preaching to the converted, that it is useful to look through the linguistic landscape lens. It is very well suited for student projects. I think as soon as they have, let's say, a mobile phone and they can do it, and that is at different ages in different countries, but it is very well suited, and then it can go on. Even students that are adult learners will have fun doing linguistic landscape project, and I think you can do it also with very young ones if you want to. It's also very useful. I've not been talking too much about, I've used the example of Basque for looking at minority languages, because as we said in the book that we edited some years ago, is that old issues of language contact and conflict, you see them in a new perspective to the linguistic landscape lens, and you learn to look at it in a different way. You can use it not only for a minority language, but in a very wide range of situations for a kind of diagnostic of the situation, to see what is going on in a certain situation, what is happening there. And sometimes people think that it is very easy, but I don't agree. I think it's underestimating completely the complexity of linguistic landscapes. When you think, oh, I go out in the world, I take a few pictures, I count how many languages are there, and that's a linguistic landscape study. I see that sometimes published, but it's not like that. It's far more complex. The linguistic landscape in itself is very complex, not only in this case in India where you have complex signs, but even a simple sign can be very complex. For instance, you can use the signs to unveil language ideologies. That is very often in the way that the languages are presented in the linguistic landscape. As I said already, our basic model is about inequality in the linguistic landscape. Well, there are ideologies related to that some languages are better than others, some languages are more valuable than others, and those things you can see reflected in the linguistic landscape. And of course, the role of global English is very important. That English is kind of everywhere. You see English, it's hard to go to a square or a street in a bigger city and not to find any English at all. So also that is one of the ways that linguistic landscape can be used a lot. And then what I find attractive about it is that idea, what I showed also in the beginning of the linguistic landscape, the picture that you can look at the whole, at the macro, you can compare cities or even countries if you want to, but look at a macro scale, and at the same time you can look at a micro scale. You can take one sign, you can try to analyze one sign in detail and see what it can teach you about the context where it's placed, because it's very important to take the context into consideration. I've been working on the linguistic landscape mainly from the context of the Basque Country. So we work mainly with Basque, Spanish, and English, and then you have already a complex context. But I think it's very important to take the context into consideration, because every context has its unique traits and will be of importance there. And then there are, of course, some challenges that we still face, because I think that a sign like this is a board that is placed at a restaurant or a cafe, and we can analyze that it has different languages, and that we see how many languages and how they're used at different in a different order. And we see Basque, we see Spanish, we see English, we see French, but well, we more or less understand how to analyze this sign, but it becomes already a lot more difficult when we look at this sign. This is much more complex to analyze, because these are signs on top of each other and continuously changing, and people write with they write their handwritten, but people put stickers. And well, how do you analyze? Is this one sign? Is this 200 signs? How do you analyze this? And then, of course, we have the challenge of the screens that we find now in the public spaces. Most of those screens have a rotating thing, like this one, very short, because it's a cutout of the thing that I found. But still, how do you analyze this type of signs? Because it can be quite complex, can be simple. And we have sometimes tried to analyze this, but it's not always easy. And well, the basic idea at the end, what we want is to understand multilingualism. That is our aim with the whole study of the linguistic landscape. And to finalize, the lesson that we have learned here, I think, is that linguistic landscape can be a start source for language acquisition, first language, second language, third language acquisition. It can enhance multilinguistic awareness. It can increase knowledge about languages, and it can also raise critical awareness on multilingualism. And we can also see that we can link the classroom with real language use in society, and I think that's very important. We can use it also, the linguistic landscape, for reflection, critical reflection among researchers ourselves. And as I showed with the students, but it also goes for myself, and I think it's the case also for many linguistic landscape researchers, you walk the streets in a different way, you see the signs in a different way. And as we said in a publication, the great potential that it displays of languages in public spaces holds for language teaching both inside and outside of the classroom. And I think my time is up, and I thank you very much. Thank you. And it's open for discussion.